I'd like to ask another thing. A lot of times, you know, what happens is I'm very affected by what you say, but then I go into the real world and my friends say, what are you talking about? I just read in the newspaper they did a scientific study and they said whatever, that you know, chemicals are great, climate change is fake, whatever they say. A lot of people don't believe a commercial from a breakfast cereal company, but when they read in the newspaper that, you know, it came from a science or research or a university, it seems like they feel like it's official. I mean, what's your opinion what's your opinion on whether when something comes from the research or scientific community, should people assume that, oh, then that's true, or is that also been hijacked by financial interests?
My former father-in-law was an IBM physicist, and his favorite book was How to Lie with Statistics.
I guess if you asked me, would you believe a study on effects of oil pollution that was funded by the National Science Foundation and done at a university, or would you believe a study on effects of oil pollution done by people at Exxon? I would believe the people in the university. Not to say the university scientists can't be dishonest, can't fudge their data. Some do. These things have come to light, instances in various aspects of scientific research, more often in the biomedical field, I think, than other fields. But I think the majority of scientists are honest and are interested in finding the truth and are doing studies to best find the truth. There are some bad apples, I acknowledge that. I think, however, that the search for truth is corrupted when there's industry money involved. Can be, not always. But when someone is funded by an oil company, there is pressure to find results more favorable to the oil company. And if you work for an oil company, your papers have to get reviewed by your higher-ups. So, you know, it's not a perfect world, but if you have university scientists, I think you have a better chance at honest people searching for the truth.
Yes, I agree pretty strongly. But there are cases, of course, where it's not so much that the university scientists are lying, but that there's a selectivity of the sort of research that can be done is research that is funded by somebody. And the bigger the science, the more equipment you need, the more expensive it is, and the more it relies on somebody funding it. So, for instance, I mean, in my field, one of the big funding agencies for oceanographic research is the Office of Naval Research. Weirdly enough, it's the Department of Defense, but they've been much more generous towards oceanographic science than civilian agencies like the National Science Foundation. So if you're an ocean scientist, you tend to get your support from the Office of Naval Research. But of course, the Office of Naval Research has a duty to sponsor research that will help the Navy to be able to exert control over the oceans better. So, for instance, for many years, the Arctic group in the Office of Naval Research, they said, oh, the problem that needs to be solved is how do ocean waves interact with sea ice? It's a very pure science problem, and so now we're going to give out lots of money so that people can go out and solve this problem. It turned out, of course, the reason was that Russian submarines were using the sea ice to get around from from the Arctic into the Atlantic and taking advantage of the fact they were sheltered from the noise of waves, of flows hitting each other, sheltered the submarine. So that was their ulterior motive. But to solve that, they sponsored a lot of research on waves in sea ice, which is a pure science. And the scientists who did all that work were getting their result. They weren't lying. They were getting valid results. They were developing models and theories of wave ice interaction, and it was a perfectly valid form of science. It's just that you wouldn't have done that if you hadn't been supported by the Office of Naval Research. You'd have done something else which you thought maybe was more important for understanding the ocean or our role in it. So it's the selectivity of science is set by the funding agencies, and so that in a sense distorts science, although the individual studies that are done in an honest way.
Just a couple quick observations, and one is the amount of public funding that underwrites public universities has been in dramatic decline for the past 30 years, such that when we talk about a state university or public university, in most cases we're talking about an institution that's receiving probably less than a quarter of its funding through public sources, and more of that funding is coming through private sources. Private sources have interests, and those interests are going to be reflected in the practices, the questions that are asked by the institution. And I would agree. I mean, I would definitely go still very much to a university scientist before I would go to a scientist from ExxonMobil. But one of the things that just amazes me is that what you would think are two of the most, should we say, conservative organizations on the planet, right? The insurance industry and the United States military, right, have absolutely no doubt in terms of their behavior, their policies, and their practices that climate change is real, it's severe, and it has to be dealt with, right? So you don't have to go to the university and sort of those crazy hippie liberals, right? Just ask the insurance companies in the U.S. military whether climate change is real.
But they believe the research from the universities that was done to get all the evidence to show that it's real, and we're caught.
Okay, why don't each of you take up to 5 minutes to give your closing thoughts on anything that you feel you would like to communicate to everyone regarding anything we've talked about tonight and anything else that's on your mind. Go ahead if anyone has any final thoughts you want to sum up with, let everyone know. Give us your full thoughts. Yeah.
My final thought is care about the ocean. It's most of our planet. Somebody had a picture of the photo that was shown from the moon when the astronauts first went to the moon, and they had the picture of the Earth. It's a blue planet. Care about the ocean.
And I would say any time that a person frames any public institution, healthcare, education, military, or our nation, by using a business metaphor, be very, very worried.
I really don't have any glib final wrap-ups. I've said enough, and I'm a hopeful person, basically, and a cheerful person, despite the quandaries that we face. And, you know, there was a lot of talk about hope in the 2008 election, and it is a quality that most of us would feel very comfortable about having, possessing. We want to have hope. But I think that there's an idea in our culture right now that hope comes from something outside of yourself and is given to you. You know, I'm going to give you hope. And that's not really how it works. How it works is you demonstrate to yourself that you're a competent person capable of meeting the exigencies of your life, and you build your confidence into becoming a person who automatically will believe that they're capable, and they're capable of discharging their obligations and taking care of the people that they love and the community that they're part of. And you know, what this really gets down to is the whole question of personal agency, and what are you going to do to try to make this a world that is worth caring about.
Yes, I'd agree, and feel that there has to be hope, and there should be, because there's always the possibility that the human race, if we can't tackle our problems, we'll develop into some creature that can. I mean, we're evolving all the time, mentally as well as physically, and the mental evolution of man through all the kind of religious leaders in history gives people a new outlook, which hopefully can lead to a better way of dealing with the world and treating the world. And so I always try to be optimistic. In fact, I give a lecture course in Italy at the moment on climate change, and I hadn't deliberately tried to be upbeat, but at the end of the lectures, the students would come up and say, Prof, they always call, Italians always call their leaders Prof, why do you look, when you've described these horrible things that are happening, why do you look so happy? And so I say, well, that's because these horrible things, I'm not going to live to see most of these horrible things, but you are.
We have time in case. Oh, go ahead, Jeffrey. And then if anyone wants to ask a question from the audience,
I was
raise your
just
hand.
going to riff on that, and you know, from my perspective, and I've talked this over with a number of people, I think there's very little reason for optimism, and there's no excuse for hopelessness.
Would anyone in the audience like to ask a question before we end? Anyone have a? Go ahead. Can we get him a microphone?
I recently heard that one of the things that's happening with the melting of the permafrost is that some diseases from the past are being, you know, reborn, like the Black Plague, like stuff that's been frozen for a long time. Is there any truth to that, or can you speak on that at all?
It's based on kind of salacious newspaper reports, but in fact, what they try to make out is that as the permafrost melts, then you've got mammoths and mastodons emerging, and if they had some ghastly disease, that will spread to the world. But actually, what's more likely is that there were people buried in the Arctic, especially victims of the Gulag, who were just sort of buried in mass graves. And a lot of them died of very nasty diseases, including the 1918 flu epidemic. And so there were, that's more likely, if there's going to be a spread of an epidemic from melting of permafrost, it's not going to be thousands of years old creatures, it's going to be tens of years old humans that will be the source.
Anyone else have a question? Go ahead.
I think the audience has probably heard me say this, but I'm going to say it again. All four of you scoffed at the sprout example that Stephen gave, and you talked at length about consumption here, And well, eating sprouts 24/7 probably gets a little old. The basic premise here is, and I know it's not the answer to all of these things, but I am concerned that the four of you, plus the other environmentalists that have been speaking, I've worked and I've been here, but most evenings, have been reticent to mention the facts that if we eliminate animal agriculture, that goes a very long way to answering some of these questions we've talked about. And animal culture and fish culture, I should say that also, which is, I think, kind of scoffed over some of the issues that the fish culture, lice and wild salmon and various other things, I'm not going to go into the details. But here again, we are at this conference and we've talked about what's best for your health. And I feel, and I know some other people here, and I know that it's documented by facts, that animal agriculture is a really big consumption issue here. But thank you very much.
What are your thoughts about the common usage of and acceptance of phrases that seem to have become brainwashing mechanisms by our unconscious acceptance of phrases in the US especially of more is better and bigger is better, and how that stops, how those cliches that are unconsciously motivating people are contrary to the acceptance of what this gentleman was saying about the cultivation of substituting the cultivation of the things that we've done and substituting them with cultivating art and music and kindness and friendship and respect. What do you think, how do we stop that kind of thing? And by the way, Steve, more is better for sprouts wouldn't interfere with that at all.
I'm not sure I understood.
The things that motivate us, that stop us from looking to really solve problems, can those be part of the words and the phrases that we seem to accept on an unconscious level or a subconscious level? Bigger is better. More is better. One neighbor has one car, you've got to have three. One person has a 1997 car, you've got to absolutely hit that, bury that one. What people are accepting is determined so much by phrases that we use. And it affects things like, it's so logical to cultivate art, music, build theaters, take people who are using their energy to put graffiti on buildings, take those people and have them make beautiful paintings on buildings like they did in Philadelphia a few years ago. There were 86 buildings, I'm sure there are more now, that have beautiful paintings on them, painted by people who were former graffiti felons.
That's a very interesting thing, because I've written about architecture and urban design for 25 years, and one of the things I noticed was that when the murals pop up in the town, what that really means is that you're not building enough buildings that are beautiful, that are produced with artistry, that tell their own story as buildings, so that you're trying to compensate for them by painting images on the walls of bad buildings that are essentially, they perform the same role as televisions, in this image-crazy culture. One of the things that you can't fail to notice in the gym, for example, is where all these people are covering themselves with tattoos, and it's like the people in this country are turning themselves into human televisions, who are broadcasting a story about their life. This is my breakup with, Josie, and this is, you know, when I won that silver medal, and, you know. So I don't think that putting murals up in cities actually says a good thing about us. What it really says is that we're incapable of building cities that have true architectural artistry.
In Philadelphia.
So it's paradoxical.
In Philadelphia, these people were not they didn't have the ability to build new buildings, but they were commissioned by Philadelphia and paid by Philadelphia, and they were given self-respect, and that was making a positive use of talent that lies in many places that is untapped. And in the 1600s and 1700s, if you've been in Germany, and I'm sure you have, in France, and there are cities that have the most beautiful murals on their walls, beautiful paintings that are still respected to this day. And
well, those are mostly inside.
no, they're outside. They're beautiful paintings
I must
on
say,
the outside.
I don't
like
think I've ever
Constance.
seen them all over France and Italy.
They're
And mostly in the United States. The
Constantine.
murals you're seeing are a psychological compensation for the fact that most of our buildings are shitty. Most of our towns are designed without any artistry whatsoever. And one other thing about that, I want to bring to your attention, the immersive ugliness that is the common milieu for human life in the United States. You know, it's something, it represents something more than a mere aesthetic problem. What it really, the immersive ugliness all around us is entropy made visible. And you're in the middle of it. And entropy is the force in the universe that takes things towards stasis and death. So it actually makes a big difference. It's important that we live in places that are completely unrewarding to us, that are completely antagonistic to the human spirit. And so I'm not in favor of murals in American towns. I'd like to see good buildings.
So, oh, go ahead.
I just want to get back to your question, which was about language and why do the words that we use distort the way we behave. I was going to say an example of one of the worst phrases that should be used is sustainable growth.
You know, the word, Bill McKibben has a book that was titled Enough. All right, there's a word we don't seem to use very often. You know, and what happened, wouldn't it be fun if every time somebody used the word bigger or better, we just substituted the word enough? And I'm seeing that word now used with regard to debates about gun deaths, debates about consumption. And so maybe a shift from bigger and better to the concept of enough. What is enough people? What is enough food? Right? What is enough square footage? I think those are the questions. And I think, you know, there was that wonderful book, Small is Beautiful. I think enough is beautiful. Small is nice. Enough is beautiful.